If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers. Maybe not even for sleep. Maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push. They float across breath, across time, across what could have been. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe. Only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that only meant to stay a minute. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. He never saw the throne, but it cost him everything. You walk through the early palace hallways, not as him, but through him as if following someone who never got far enough to leave footprints. The boy is still small, barely out of linen wraps, but the corridors are already wide with expectation. The throne at the end of the marble gallery glows in morning dust, waiting. But it wasn't made for a child. It was made for someone half god, half warning. And so the boy stayed away. They called him CAESARION, or Little Caesar. But names in palaces are never just names. They're mirrors. He was born from one empire and into another. His mother CLEOPATRA would whisper Rome as a threat and Egypt as a promise. And the boy grew with both coiled around his ribs. A Roman nose, an Egyptian crown, and no safe place to put either. From the beginning, he was not raised to sit but to survive. And survival here meant never being fully seen. The light in his room was soft. The tutors were quiet. And even his laughter was something guards turned their heads from. Power, when it comes too early, makes even a child feel like a sword someone forgot to sheath. The soft, the still, the hollow, they were the only places left where he could be a boy. You remember watching the court when he was carried in? His feet didn't touch the ground, but his name had already taken root in the dust of the room. There were men who bowed too deeply, and others who wouldn't meet his gaze. To some, he was a symbol of alliance. To others, a thorn in a story they were still writing. The silence followed him like a shadow that never matched his height. They say Cleopatra kissed his forehead every morning and told him he was destined for more than survival. But even she couldn't paint that picture clearly. The paint kept running. The frame kept cracking. What does a throne look like to a boy who never saw one used without blood? Outside, the Nile still moved slowly, thick with memory. Inside, the palace remained too quiet for a dynasty. Every hallway hummed with things unsaid. Historians still debate whether Cleopatra truly believed he could rule, or if she simply needed him to exist long enough to anchor her rule, long enough to postpone Rome's breath on her neck. Some argue he was her political strategy. Others whisper he was her final attempt to keep love alive, etched in the small, slow rhythms of a child. But what's certain is this: he was a boy with a throne that glowed in poems and glared in strategy meetings, a throne that would never hold him. Not because he wasn't ready, but because the world never planned to let him reach it. Even now, you can almost feel his small hand pressed against the cold stone wall outside the council chamber, listening to voices arguing over his future, not understanding the words, only the tone, the sharpness, the hush that followed. The throne remained empty, but not unguarded. The soft repetition of rituals tried to convince everyone that a future was being prepared. The ceremonial robes, the miniature scepter carved from olive wood, the lessons in rhetoric, law, and silence. But the silence weighed more than the rest, and he carried it in his shoulders even as a child hunched, not from burden, but from knowing too early that power was something you wore like a disguise, not a reward. You wonder if he ever touched that throne, Just once, late at night, when no one watched, or if he only stared at it, like a mountain that moved every time he blinked. There's a strange kind of grief that forms around the things we almost inherited. You don't miss what you had. You miss what was supposed to be yours until the wind changed direction. Maybe Cleopatra saw it too. Maybe that's why she kept him near the gardens, where the statues cracked softly and the reeds brushed the air with no agenda, where names didn't weigh so much, where the throne couldn't reach. But even then, the whispers came. The Senate in Rome had heard. The boy existed. That was enough. That's all it takes sometimes, not ambition, not rebellion, not violence, just a name, spoken too clearly, written too soon. A throne that was carved for him, but never warmed by his presence, and now too soft to hold anything but dust. Names in history often arrive too early or too late, but Caesarion's name arrived precisely when no one was ready to hear it. You walk beside him again, not as his servant, not as his mother, not even as a shadow, just as someone watching from the edge of a breath. In Alexandria, even the sand seems to wait when names like his are spoken, not whispered, not declared, just said. As if saying it louder would make the empire shift, as if naming him might conjure the very inheritance that both Egypt and Rome had already begun to fear. He was born Ptolemy XV, Philopator, Philometor, Caesar. But even the palace shortened it. The boy who carried both bloodlines, the Nile and the Tiber, the cobra and the eagle, needed a name that could fit in a mouth and still leave room for strategy. So they called him Caesarion, Little Caesar, but no one called him small. From his earliest days, the world insisted he was a question mark. To Egypt, he was a divine continuation, son of Cleopatra, last great hope of a once golden line. To Rome, he was a rumor that could destroy Augustus before Augustus ever crowned himself. And so his name never stood still. It didn't matter how soft his fingers were, or how gently he held his tutor's scrolls. The name wrapped around him like armor made of silk, beautiful, delicate, and entirely unsuited for war, but still dangerous, still enough to raise eyebrows in Senate halls thousands of miles away. Cleopatra understood that, perhaps better than anyone. That's why she used his name not as a declaration, but as a tool. She placed it carefully in letters, in ceremonies, on the edges of conversations with foreign envoys, never too loudly, but never forgotten. She didn't need Rome to believe in him. She only needed them to wonder. And they did? You imagine the moment she first said his name in front of visiting Roman officials, soft and direct, the way only a queen can speak when holding a secret. Caesarion, as if tasting the word, watching its weight fall across the marble floor between her throne and theirs, as if waiting to see which men flinched. The walls didn't record those moments, but the silence that followed did. Some scholars say the name was political theater, that Cleopatra used her son's identity as an extension of her power. Others suggest she believed in his divine lineage, that she saw in him a rebirth of the world that had once raised Alexander and would never raise another. But belief and survival rarely follow the same riverbed. And in her palace, even belief had to be strategic. She gave him the name of an empire, but not the tools to carry it. Not yet. And so the boy learned to walk beneath its weight without stumbling. His childhood was a contradiction filled with joy in private gardens and carefully arranged silences in public appearances. Tutors taught him logic and mathematics, but no one taught him how to breathe in a room where every glance measured his future. No one told him that even his laughter might be read as intention, that even a child's joy could be seen as provocation when the world already considered his bloodline an act of rebellion. He studied in Greek, prayed in Egyptian, and was rumored in Latin. And all the while, the name traveled farther than he ever did. It slipped into scrolls sent to Roman allies, appeared in graffiti on Alexandria's outer walls, and drifted like incense through markets filled with people who had never seen him but believed he might be the one to bring Egypt back to itself. That kind of hope is a curse, especially for a boy, because names aren't just identities, they're doors. And once opened, they can't be shut again, not without sealing something else inside. In time, even the whisper of CAESARION became enough to stall decisions in Rome. Senators grew cautious. The word heir began to float in conversations that had nothing to do with legality and everything to do with fear. For Octavian, who would later become Augustus, CAESARION represented more than a political inconvenience. He represented a mirror that could not be unbroken, a reflection of what might have been if Caesar had lived long enough to name a true successor from a different world. And that, more than anything, made the boy dangerous, not because he held power, but because his very existence suggested another ending. Still, Cleopatra never stopped placing that name where it needed to be soft, slow, deliberate. She didn't throw it into war speeches or parade it before the people like a crown. She inserted it the way one sets a coin beneath a stone quietly, as offering, an omen. And CAESARION, still young, still watching, learned what it meant to be powerful in silence. The empire may have been written in stone, but his name was carved into softer things, papyrus scrolls, wind over water, the hush before negotiations. And even when the world wasn't looking directly at him, it listened, it waited, it braced. Because names like his don't fade. They don't fall away with the tides. They echo especially in rooms where no one dares say them aloud. There are rooms built to hold power, and there are rooms built to hide it. CAESARION grew up in the latter. The chamber was tucked behind a veined curtain of lapis and linen, narrow in design but filled with heavy air. You wouldn't notice it walking the palace halls, not unless you were meant to. But those who entered never forgot where it was, nor what they carried out from inside. It wasn't a war room. It wasn't a nursery. It was something far more dangerous, a place where lineage became strategy. And a boy's existence was a fact that needed constant editing. This was where advisors leaned close, speaking not to be heard, but simply to release the burden of holding thoughts too long. Their voices stayed low, even when the door was shut, not from fear of spies, but from the weight of what they were discussing. Because to speak of CAESARION was to touch something unfinished, something alive and political and fragile. He was not just Cleopatra's son, he was Caesar's, and that meant his bloodline was a threat disguised as potential. The quiet in that room wasn't accidental, it was policy. The walls were soft with fabric, not stone. Nothing echoed. You could say a name and it would land in the folds of the curtain instead of traveling. The design was intentional, a place where secrets could exhale and die slowly, instead of spreading. And so they talked, but only in suggestion. Never the full name, never the word heir unless wrapped in qualifiers. The boy, the child, her son. Euphemisms were the currency of those meetings, and everyone became fluent. You imagine Cleopatra sitting in that room, not as queen, but as a mother, navigating the thorns of survival. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She listened. She chose her words like stones laid into a river, crossing not too close, not too far apart, each one placed so as not to slip. And when she finally did speak, it wasn't to declare a plan. It was to correct the shape of silence around her son. She didn't need them to protect him. She needed them to understand that he was already protecting Egypt by existing. That's the tragedy no one wrote down. CAESARION never had a chance to be only a child. He was born at the intersection of two narratives that would not reconcile. And he grew up in a palace that could never fully admit he was even there. The guards bowed to him, yes, but only slightly. Tutors taught him with formality, but kept their affection quiet. Even the servants gave him gifts with downcast eyes, as if giving too much joy might summon consequences. There's a memory, half-remembered, half-imagined CAESARION peeking from behind the doorframe during one of those meetings, unnoticed, but not unlistening. His hands are still ink-stained from lessons. He's not supposed to be there, but he doesn't leave. He stands in the stillness, hearing the shape of his future spelled out in fragments. Words like Roman succession, military preparedness, optics, and Augustus. Words that don't belong in a child's world, but were never not in his. He knew what his blood meant before he understood how blood worked, and somehow he carried it with more grace than those who feared it most. There are still scholars who question the logistics. Was Caesarion truly Caesar's son? Was his parentage ever proven beyond Cleopatra's word? Were those whispers in that room built on hope, manipulation, or something more honest? But the historical record doesn't change the truth of how it felt. The whispers existed. The fear they generated was real. And the boy bore their weight whether or not the DNA matched. Because sometimes, history believes a story so hard it doesn't matter if it's true. It becomes true by how loudly it's denied. And so Caesarion's life continued, not in declarations, but in managed quiet. His movements were tracked not by force, but by formality. His presence at rituals was negotiated like treaty terms. Even his education was shaped not around what he needed, but what it would look like if he knew too much. He studied astronomy, but never the stars of Rome. He learned law, but not imperial jurisprudence. He memorized speeches, but was told not to speak them outside the school chamber. Every skill was both a privilege and a danger, sharpened just enough to be impressive, but never so much that they cut into anyone else's legacy. There's a kind of slow erosion that happens when a person is prepared for a future they're not allowed to reach. And Caesarion, despite his tutors, despite his lineage, despite the faded ambitions etched around him, was being shaped into a man who would inherit nothing visible. Not because he was unworthy, but because history already had a script for his kind, the sons born too late, with names too long and destinies too convenient to let play out. And yet, even in that quiet room, there was something powerful growing. Because Caesarion was not just remembered for what he was supposed to be, he was remembered for what he made people afraid he might become. Power unexpressed, yet present. Authority wrapped in silk. Sitting beside a mother who understood that the greatest influence is often what you never quite see, only sense. Like the faint warmth after someone leaves a room. It's easy to write history from the seats of victors, but to listen for it, from behind doors like this one, is to hear the sounds of futures that never had the time to arrive. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. There are names that follow you like banners. Others follow like ghosts. For Caesarion, the name Julius Caesar was both. A father who was not there. A god who had been declared divine. A man turned myth by the very world that now denied the boy his place within it. From the beginning, Caesarion grew in the shadow of a man he never met. And that shadow did not stretch gently. It pressed downward heavy, long, and filled with contradictions. The palace rarely spoke of Caesar directly. The Roman world had already begun the process of replacing him with something more palatable, a lineage forged not by blood, but by loyalty. Octavian's soon-to-be Augustus was rewriting the future, and part of that rewriting involved erasing what didn't fit. A child born to Cleopatra, across the sea, beyond the Senate's reach, complicated that future too much. So the name Caesar became a kind of risk, spoken in ritual, painted on statues, etched into coins, but always with care, always with distance, especially when tied to a child who might claim it too literally. And yet, Cleopatra never flinched from using it. She spoke of Caesar with reverence, but also with precision. In the great hall where foreign dignitaries gathered, she would refer to her son's father with carefully constructed phrases, not as a lover, not even as a partner, but as a man who, through destiny and divine alignment, had created what she believed to be the continuation of something ancient and sacred. Caesarion was framed not as a political inheritance, but as a spiritual one. Still, everyone in the room knew what it meant. There was a sharpness to how people responded when the boy entered with that lineage sewn into his presence, not just because of what it symbolized, but because of what it threatened. The Roman world had moved on. It had killed the dictator. It had mourned, then pivoted. It had handed power to men who wanted to control how the past was remembered. And here was a child who embodied a version of that past. No one wanted to confront a living challenge to the story Rome was trying to tell about itself. Even within Alexandria, people watched Caesarion with layered gazes. To some, he was the living heir of Caesar, the boy destined to restore Egypt's influence and force Rome to reckon with its unfinished debts. To others, he was an echo of a disaster waiting to unfold a fragile hope built on the bones of a dead man and a queen too bold for her own time. But Caesarion was neither myth nor prophecy. He was a boy, and he grew up not knowing how to fit inside the empty shape his father left behind. You imagine him walking the garden's edge, olive trees lining the paths, the heat of the sun filtered through linen shades. Somewhere nearby, his tutors wait, holding scrolls on governance and statecraft. But Caesarion hesitates. There is a statue ahead, tucked between vines. It is not his mother. It is not a god. It is Caesar stern, stylized, with eyes carved to look beyond. The boy looks up at it, and he does not bow. There's a quiet question that lingers in that moment, one that likely followed him for the rest of his short life. What does it mean to belong to someone who no longer exists? And more urgently, what does it mean when that someone's enemies still exist and have learned how to write the ending? Rome, despite its expanding borders and tightening control, remained obsessed with legitimacy. That obsession was both its weakness and its tool. Octavian knew this, and so did Cleopatra, which is why her insistence on Caesarion's bloodline was both maternal and strategic. She wasn't just naming him as Caesar's son. She was placing him on the chessboard as the one piece Rome couldn't move without acknowledging its own hypocrisy. And the Senate, calculating, seasoned, unwilling to gamble, hated the implication. It was never about whether Caesarion had the right to rule. It was about whether Rome could afford to let him exist without losing control of its narrative. And so silence became the safest path. In Alexandria, the court gradually stopped referring to Caesar directly in connection with the boy, not from disloyalty, but from caution. Cleopatra continued the rituals, kept the Roman marble polished, kept the language of divine birth alive. But she did so with increasing subtlety. Caesarion's schooling included Latin history, but omitted Caesar's personal legacy. He learned the founding myths of Rome, but not the civil war that followed. His world was curated to prepare him for a throne, but not for the fight to reach it. Perhaps Cleopatra thought she could delay the danger. That, by softening the references, by dressing her son in quieter versions of power, the world would forget to fear him long enough for him to grow into someone they might accept. But fear doesn't vanish. It adapts. And in Rome, the fear of Caesarion matured just as quickly as the boy himself. By the time Octavian rose to prominence and began to consolidate his version of the Republic, Caesarion had become a subject of speculation in taverns and temples alike. Not because of anything he had done, but because of who people believed he might become. His father's shadow had moved from myth into paranoia. Even the softest boy becomes a danger when the wrong people believe he holds a claim to power. And so, in both Rome and Alexandria, people stopped asking about Caesarion's father. They asked instead what would happen if the child lived long enough to become a man. They whispered, quietly but insistently, whether the crown would fit too well, whether the empire, already bending under its contradictions, would split further if his name was said too often, too loudly, or in the wrong place. Silence, once a strategy, had become a sentence. A palace is often mistaken for a sanctuary. To the outsider, its columns gleam with certainty, Its walls hold back the chaos of the outside world, and its golden thresholds suggest comfort, stability, and command. But for Caesarion, the palace was a contradiction wrapped in ceremony. It sheltered him, yes, but not from fear, only from visibility. And in a world where perception was power, being hidden was just another kind of threat. He was raised in abundance, surrounded by tutors, musicians, physicians, and architects of thought, all carefully selected, all loyal to the queen. He slept on imported linens, dined from polished obsidian, and walked under ceilings painted with stars he had not yet seen. His feet rarely touched sand unless permitted. His childhood, in form, was one of privilege. But in spirit, it was hemmed in by an anxious choreography, one designed not to nurture greatness, but to keep danger from knocking too loudly. Everything around him was softened, quieted, staged, not out of indulgence, but out of caution. The golden cups were polished not to impress, but to distract. The layers of fine linen served as armor for a boy who would never wear a breastplate. Even the figs in his bowls were chosen not just for ripeness, but for symbolism, fertility, survival, the illusion of plenty. He was given every material comfort, yet none of it was allowed to become habit. He was taught not to crave, not to expect, not to assume that what was his would remain his for long, because power in Alexandria was ornate, but brittle, and his mother, wise to the sharp edge of Roman steel, knew that beauty alone would not protect them. In his lessons, Caesarion was encouraged to memorize the deeds of rulers, to trace their victories and losses like the lines of a constellation, but there was always something unspoken in the way his tutors moved through certain chapters. When it came to Roman history, especially the years just before his birth, the tone shifted. Paragraphs were read faster. Names were pronounced without pause. The facts remained, but the breath behind them thinned. It was through these absences that Caesarion learned his most enduring lesson. Fear does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives in omission, in the way grown men glance at each other before answering, in the way his mother looked out the window before replying to a question she had clearly heard, in the way his name, strong in theory, delicate in practice, was used only when necessary. From an early age, he began to sense that everything around him shimmered with the tension of a postponed decision. Alexandria waited. The court waited. Even his playmates, handpicked from noble families, carried an unease, laughing too carefully, too obediently. He was always the center of the game, but never allowed to lose, or win, or choose. One afternoon, during a festival rehearsal, he was meant to carry a small ceremonial orb across the grand courtyard. It was symbolic, the future ruler presenting the heart of Egypt to the gathered crowd. But the moment the doors opened and the trumpets sounded, Caesarion froze, not from fear of the audience, but from something subtler. He realized he didn't know which step to take first. The courtyard, polished to a blinding gloss, reflected his face in every direction. He saw himself everywhere and nowhere. The orb trembled in his hands, not because it was heavy, but because it felt unearned. He took the step anyway, and the court applauded, but that moment never left him. Some say children don't notice fear unless it is spoken aloud. But Caesarion lived in a palace where fear was folded into every corner. It came not with shouting or slaps, but with delay, with glances, with the sound of guards shifting in doorways late at night. The queen's voice never cracked, but the instructions changed daily. One day the boy was to learn Latin poetry. The next, he was told to practice silence. One day his portrait was commissioned, grand and framed in laurel. The next, it was moved from the hall and stored quietly behind velvet drapes. Historians still argue over the motivations of Cleopatra in these years. Was she grooming her son for a future on the throne? Or was she building a myth, one that could outlive him if necessary? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps she was simply navigating a day at a time, aware that one misstep, one scroll falling into the wrong hands, one servant's misplaced loyalty, could trigger a response from Rome that would undo everything she had preserved. And so, the child was raised in gold, but always watched for cracks in the ceiling. There's something tragically familiar in this, the idea that the very tools meant to protect a child can slowly become the walls that isolate him. CAESARION was surrounded by people who loved him, or claimed to, but none who could afford to act on that love without restraint. Affection, in a royal court, must often be disguised as duty, and for a child whose birth was as symbolic as it was human, that affection often felt procedural. He was embraced, but carefully, encouraged, but never indulged, taught, but never trusted with the full truth. Still, he grew tall, with the striking profile of both his parents. His hands, once soft, became articulate, skilled at writing, at carving, at folding maps he was never allowed to travel. He began to ask sharper questions, to challenge the gaps in his education, to notice which guests avoided his eyes and which addressed him too formally for comfort. And yet, he didn't rebel. He adapted. Because even at 12, CAESARION understood that safety had a script, and he was expected to recite it perfectly. From the gardens, he would often watch the harbor, the sails blooming and folding like lungs in the wind. He asked, once, how long it took a ship to reach Rome. The servant didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because the question itself was too loud. And in that pause, CAESARION learned something else. The speed of ships did not matter. What mattered was who was sailing them, and why. There is a particular kind of loneliness reserved for those born between two worlds. For CAESARION, every lesson, every gesture, every glance that lingered too long reminded him that he was not quite one thing nor another. His mother was Egypt. His father was Rome. Yet he belonged fully to neither. In the quiet moments between ceremonial appearances and whispered strategy meetings, he began to recognize that this in-betweenness wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. He was taught to carry both identities, but not to favor either. On one side stood Egypt, ancient and mythic, a kingdom that had learned to survive by wrapping itself in its own grandeur, by telling the same story louder each time it was challenged. On the other stood Rome, young by comparison, but ruthless in its hunger, expanding not just through force, but through narrative, absorbing and rewriting everything it touched. And here was CAESARION, child of the most powerful woman in Egypt and the most assassinated man in Rome, expected to embody something coherent, something useful, something palatable. The contradiction was never hidden from him. When he studied the gods, he learned to name them twice. When he sat at feasts, the language spoken across the table shifted from Greek to Latin to Egyptian. Not out of politeness, but out of necessity, a rotating performance to keep every faction appeased. At formal events, he wore robes dyed in Tyrian purple, trimmed with Egyptian gold, each thread representing a different allegiance, none of them entirely his. He was fluent in languages, fluent in masks, fluent in deflection, a prince educated in the art of not being seen too clearly. But there were moments when the illusions slipped, and in those moments, CAESARION began to understand just how precarious his existence truly was. He once overheard a merchant whispering in the palace courtyard that the boy would never rule. "He's half a god, half a ghost," the man muttered, thinking himself unheard. CAESARION never forgot the words. They didn't sting because they were cruel. They stung because they rang true. When your identity is built from opposites, every choice feels like a betrayal. Cleopatra, for all her brilliance, could not remove this burden. She could teach him to speak with clarity, to walk with composure, to defer with dignity. But she could not simplify the world he had been born into. She could not make him Roman enough to be safe from Rome, nor Egyptian enough to be unquestioned by Egypt. She tried, She surrounded him with scholars from both traditions. She offered him rituals from both sides. But it was always clear, painfully so, that no matter how far she reached, she could not stretch the distance between his two inheritances into something seamless. And CAESARION knew this, not because she told him, but because she didn't. He became skilled at reading the silences, at recognizing when a door stayed open too long, or when a sentence ended half a thought early. He knew which court officials truly supported him, and which ones simply bowed because they were afraid not to. He began to observe the guards as much as the tutors, not because he feared them, but because he understood that survival was not a gift, it was a calculation, and every variable mattered. As he grew older, the palace around him seemed to shrink. The gardens became more contained, the windows more guarded, the visitors fewer. What had once felt vast and golden began to resemble something else, not a prison exactly, but not a sanctuary either. It was, instead, a stage. And the boy playing the role of heir began to realize that even the most lavish sets can collapse the moment the audience stops believing. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all loosened. He found them in the library, where scrolls smelled of cedar and sea salt, and no one asked who he was supposed to become. There, among faded philosophies and foreign poems, he discovered ideas that didn't demand allegiance, only attention. He read of kings who abdicated, of soldiers who planted gardens, of gods who slept. He lingered over tales of orphans who survived not because they had power, but because they became invisible. And slowly, without telling anyone, he began to write not proclamations or decrees, but questions. What happens to a child raised to be everything? What happens when the two halves that shaped him begin to war inside him? The answers never came clearly, but he returned to the questions often. There is one fragment left, a piece of papyrus found generations later, perhaps penned in his own hand. Though no one can say for certain, it contains only one line. A rope braided from sun and stone will break before it bends. Scholars still debate what it means, but if you listen closely, if you imagine the tone in which it was written, you can almost hear the quiet exhaustion of someone who knew intimately what it meant to be torn by the very forces that created him. Cleopatra, in her way, tried to preserve what she could. She invoked CAESARION's heritage when useful, deflected it when not. She placed him beside her in ceremonies, but rarely alone. She ensured his safety through ritual and repetition. But even she could not shield him from the fact that he was becoming a symbol more than a son, a figurehead not of power, but of potential. And the world's favorite pastime is extinguishing potential before it becomes inconvenient. If CAESARION had been merely Roman, he might have been absorbed. If he had been purely Egyptian, perhaps accepted. But in being both, he became something the ancient world could not process, a future that could not be controlled. And futures like that rarely last long. In the vast architecture of empire, some inherit thrones, others inherit methods of survival. CAESARION, raised under columns older than the memory of his bloodline, was given both, or perhaps neither, depending on who was watching. From the earliest stages of his life, it became apparent that to remain still was not to be idle, but to be deliberate. He was taught how to speak, of course, and how to stand with the proper weight distribution between his heels and toes, so as to signal confidence without arrogance. He learned the mechanics of greeting, the subtle calculations embedded in timing, and the manner in which the crown's imagined gravity should seem to press softly against one's spine, pulling posture upright. But beneath these performative skills, another set of lessons was taking root, more vital and more quietly taught lessons in presence that required one to reduce visibility, not amplify it. It was in how he entered rooms, not first, never last, in how he held his gaze direct enough to appear attentive, but never insistent. It was in the tone of voice his instructors sculpted carefully into the mid-range of diplomacy firm, but forgettable. These were not lessons aimed at preparing him for the spotlight. They were blueprints for blending into the palace walls without vanishing from the ledger of succession. And in this choreography of stillness, Caesarion slowly mastered the art of being central without being exposed. There were advantages to this cultivated subtlety. In a world increasingly dictated by whispers and blades concealed beneath tunics, to be overlooked could be safer than to be celebrated. He was a prince whose destiny was discussed across continents, yet whose daily routines remained cloaked in a strange privacy. His movements within the palace became a kind of map, known only to a few, a carefully negotiated circuit from study hall to garden path, from observatory chamber to his mother's side during court appearances. The walls remembered him, but the city never quite did. And this was no accident. Cleopatra, ever conscious of Rome's watching eye, adjusted the angles of Caesarion's public life with the same precision she used to align stars on ceremonial days. To the people of Alexandria, he was a symbol. To the court, a cautious hope. But to Rome, he needed to be something else entirely, an idea blurred enough that it couldn't provoke action. As long as Caesarion remained undefined, not clearly heir, not clearly threat, he could exist without immediate consequence. And so his visibility became the tightrope Cleopatra walked each morning. It is difficult, however, to raise a child in fragments. What may seem strategically prudent from the balcony of empire becomes more complex in the heart of a boy expected to piece himself together from half-truths and rehearsed omissions. And Caesarion, though compliant, was never dull. He recognized the pattern long before he understood its rationale. There was always a difference in tone when his name was spoken near foreign guests, always a sudden narrowing of options when it came time to choose which scrolls to read, which rituals to observe. He noticed the distance between the promise of authority and the reality of his confinement, a distance that widened with every passing year. By the time he reached adolescence, the boundaries of his life had settled into something precise but airless. He was present at religious festivals, but only as an ornament beside Cleopatra. He was included in royal proclamations, but never as their voice. He was depicted in murals, always beside her, never alone. And though the palace praised his education, his tutors reported to his mother, not to him. In all ways that mattered, he remained tethered not out of neglect, but out of design. One could call it protective. One could also call it a quiet exile. Within this structure, he developed habits that spoke volumes. He rarely raised his voice, even in frustration. He learned to pause before answering, as though weighing not just his words, but their implications. He avoided interruptions, even when curious, and once told a servant that questions asked too quickly were like stones thrown into still water, useful only to those who don't mind disturbing what lies beneath. It was the kind of statement that lingered, quiet and precise, the voice of a boy already too accustomed to measuring his own echo. Even leisure bore the marks of containment. He took walks at dusk, not midday. He studied astronomy, not for conquest, but for rhythm. He wrote, but burned most of it. The pages that remained were rarely declarations. They were observations soft, steady attempts to name a world he wasn't allowed to fully enter. "I am not a branch," he scribbled once in the margin of a geography scroll. "I am the wind moving between them." There's no official record of when he began to grasp the totality of what was being withheld from him. Some suggest it was gradual, a slow awakening, layered into each ceremonial denial. Each moment he was allowed to stand beside the throne, but not touch it. Others claim it came in one precise instant, a letter intercepted, a conversation overheard, a Roman emissary's glance that revealed too much. Regardless of the timeline, what mattered was not when he realized it, but how deeply he internalized it. To survive, Caesarion would have to embody stillness so convincingly that even ambition would hesitate to knock. And so he vanished without ever leaving the palace. He became a rumor with a face and name that circulated in scrolls and senate halls, growing sharper in fear even as the boy himself grew quieter in reality. Perhaps the most haunting irony is that the more he disappeared from view, the more dangerous he became. Rome does not fear bold declarations. It fears quiet claims, those not yet made, but impossible to ignore. Caesarion's life became a quiet claim, a held breath, a paused sentence. And in the architecture of politics, such things often collapse before they can be resolved. You wonder if he ever longed to shatter the illusion, to run, to scream, to demand clarity from a world that had only given him fragments. But there is no evidence of rebellion, no tantrums recorded, no late-night escapes attempted. Only this, a boy who learned that the softest path through danger was not retreat, but patience. Not protest, but invisibility. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. Not all declarations arrive with fanfare. Some travel across oceans, folded into scrolls sealed with wax, their ink still damp from urgency. Some do not arrive at all, intercepted, redirected, or destroyed by hands loyal to causes no longer spoken aloud. But among the many secrets that passed between Alexandria and Rome during those final years, the letters concerning Caesarion held a unique kind of weight. They were at once affirmations and provocations, soft in tone, but sharp in consequence. You can imagine the way they were written, not by Caesarion himself, of course, not yet, but by those who saw in him more than a child. They saw a hinge, a possibility, a lever that could change the balance of power if placed correctly. These letters, composed with the care of men who knew both history and danger, made their way across the Mediterranean on diplomatic vessels, often under false names or buried within cargo lists. On the surface, they might have spoken of grain yields or shipping routes, but hidden between lines was a name, and behind that name a question that neither Rome nor Egypt could answer without consequence. Caesarion, was he Caesar's true son? Did the great Julius leave behind not just a legacy, but an heir? Was the boy a rightful successor to the Roman ideal, or a political fiction designed to embarrass and destabilize? Each letter that mentioned him was a kind of experiment, a test of reaction. Cleopatra understood this. She had learned long ago that the truth mattered far less than the way it was framed. And so she permitted his name to appear selectively, not in proclamations, but in rumor, not in edicts, but in correspondence. It was a strategy rooted in survival to keep Caesarion real enough to be considered, but vague enough to be unconfirmed. Historians debate the nature of these communications. Some suggest they were deliberate provocations, attempts to stir uncertainty in Rome's already splintering political elite. Others believe they were acts of maternal desperation, Cleopatra reaching out to former allies of Caesar, hoping to secure recognition for her son before Octavian could fully rewrite the past. But what all agree on is the effect Caesarion became a topic of conversation, then of concern, and eventually of strategy. His name began to ripple through forums and military briefings, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he might one day claim. In this way, the letters became instruments of identity and threat. Each mention of his name folded into parchment was an act of resistance against the version of history Octavian was crafting for himself. Each phrase suggesting legitimacy was a blow to the narrative that Rome had already begun carving into its marble temples, that Octavian, adopted though he was, stood as the rightful heir to Caesar's power. This tension created a quiet but persistent war of words. In Rome, Octavian and his circle responded through counter-narratives, leaks to sympathetic senators, and carefully crafted rhetoric. Publicly, they refrained from direct attacks, but in private, they were meticulous. They questioned the timing of Caesarion's birth. They cast doubt on Cleopatra's claims. They referred to her child as a royal bastard, a phrase that cloaked disdain beneath formality. And yet the letters kept coming. not from Cleopatra alone, but from a growing web of Eastern officials and neutral observers who saw in CAESARION the potential for continuity. Some were loyal to the queen, others simply intrigued by what it might mean for the old balance of power to shift. Their words were cautious, but unmistakable. The boy grows tall. He favors the line of his father. There is strength in him, though he has not yet spoken. These weren't just reports. They were whispers into the ear of empire. For CAESARION, the impact of these letters was both invisible and all-consuming. He never saw most of them. Their contents were filtered, translated, summarized. But their consequences shaped his every day. More guards at the gates, more rules around movement, more hesitations in his mother's voice when speaking of the future. The palace adjusted to the growing weight of an identity that could not be fully carried, yet could no longer be set down. He began to understand that the world was now asking something of him he had not agreed to be the embodiment of an unresolved question, whether he liked it or not. His existence had become a line drawn through two empires, and every breath he took was measured by men deciding how best to erase it. And yet, for all their planning, those men never seemed to agree on who CAESARION actually was. To some, he was a son. To others, a symbol. To a few, a threat. But to most, he was something harder to confront: a disruption in the story. History, especially Roman history, depends on neat succession, on the clean handover of power, even when it's soaked in blood. CAESARION interrupted that. His name forced the re-examination of legitimacy. His blood complicated the divine narratives Octavian needed to construct. It is said that Caesar's final words were not recorded clearly. Some say he spoke to Brutus. Others say he said nothing at all. But imagine if, in the moment between the blade and silence, he thought not of betrayal, but of the child he had left behind, not in Rome, not in a Senate hall, but in the arms of a queen whom the Republic had never fully trusted. That thought, even as a possibility, would have been enough to unnerve the men who came after him. So the letters continued, a kind of echo, soft but persistent, like the hush of water brushing stone. If you stood in the archives now, where only fragments remain, you would find scraps bearing CAESARION's name not in bold declarations, but in margins, side notes, seals pressed with half-broken rings. These remnants are not dramatic. They are quiet, faint, but they are enough to tell you what mattered. Someone kept saying his name, long after it became dangerous, long after silence would have been safer. And perhaps that's what makes these letters most remarkable. Not their content, not their craft, but their refusal to vanish. In a world where kings are forgotten with statues still standing, CAESARION's name survived not through war, not through coronation, but through parchment and risk, through a slow, steady insistence that he had been born, that he had been named, and that the world had not yet decided what to do with him. Some names thunder across time, others haunt it quietly. There comes a point when even a palace runs out of places to hide what must not be found. And for Cleopatra, who had spent years navigating the tides of diplomacy, survival, and legacy with the precision of a scholar priestess, that moment arrived more gradually than suddenly. The corridors that once held her confidence began to feel like stone ledgers recording everything, forgiving nothing. Her bodyguards, loyal though they were, started asking quieter questions. The servants who had once hummed in the background now moved more cautiously, their eyes lingering a breath too long on every closed door. Alexandria was still her city, but its walls had become too full of listening. And the one thing the queen could not afford to be overheard discussing anymore was her son. There was once a time when she had celebrated his presence openly, the ceremony of his naming, the careful inscriptions commissioned to honor his heritage, the delicate way his image was placed beside hers in temples and public art. All of it had served to build a narrative of continuity. He was to be the thread that stitched the Ptolemaic line into eternity. But that time was fading. The empire, her empire, was no longer a thing she could protect through declaration. Rome was pressing in, not just with soldiers, but with decisions already made. And so, the question she now faced was not how to elevate Caesarion, but how to preserve what little of him the world had not yet claimed. It is one thing to prepare a child for a throne. It is another to realize that no throne will remain. Cleopatra was not naive. Her political instincts had been sharpened through years of dealing with rival claimants, military failures, and shifting alliances. But none of that compared to the complexity of this situation, where the mere fact of her son's bloodline had become a provocation, and where silence now held more power than proclamation. She began, slowly at first, to pull back his presence from public life. The portraits ceased. The scrolls no longer mentioned his name in the same breath as divinity. The formal titles once attached to him, son of the divine Caesar, king of kings, were used less often, eventually falling out of usage entirely, except in private prayer. His education continued, but more quietly, under fewer tutors, and with materials that emphasized philosophy and poetry rather than statecraft or military doctrine. Some read this as abandonment. Others saw it as an act of love. Because to protect him, Cleopatra had to begin the painful process of dismantling the very myth she had worked so hard to build. The myth of continuity, the myth of power through lineage, the myth that blood alone was destiny. Even within the palace, the spaces where Caesarion could move freely grew smaller. The gardens, once wide and open to him, became curated paths under closer guard. The audience halls were replaced by private chambers, the sea-facing balconies, from which he once watched the ships come and go, were curtained more often, not only for privacy but for protection. Not all enemies wore swords. Some arrived as glances, as gestures too polite, as envoys too curious. And as the walls closed in, Cleopatra found herself staring at things longer than she used to. Objects began to carry memories more than purpose. The necklace she wore during Caesarion's naming ceremony, the robe with its fading embroidery from a distant coronation, a small ink stain on a cushion from the first day he practiced writing in hieroglyphs. Nothing had changed visibly, and yet everything had. You can imagine her at her writing table late at night, surrounded by maps she no longer trusted, and letters she no longer answered. The candle burns low, and she does not notice. She is not planning strategy anymore. She is remembering, not from nostalgia, but from calculation. Which details must be hidden, which names must no longer be spoken, which objects must be moved from visibility before another delegation arrives, and above all, where the last traces of her son could be buried, not physically, but politically, so that Rome might find nothing worth pursuing. Because that was the truth she could not say aloud. It wasn't Caesarion's body that was in danger. It was his name, his claim, his meaning, his existence as a possibility. Rome did not need to kill the boy. It needed to erase what he represented. And so Cleopatra began to bury him not in soil, but in secrecy, in misdirection, in the careful redirection of attention. The more the court focused on Mark Antony and his growing missteps, the less they spoke of Caesarion. The more she reminded the public of her own legacy, the less they asked about her sons. It was not deception, it was insulation. Historians, in their need for clarity, often miss the emotional texture of this decision. They tally the changes in political titles, the shifts in ceremonial attendance, the sudden disappearance of Caesarion from certain public records, and they call it strategy. But they overlook the ache, the devastating calculus of a mother who had to choose between memory and survival, between visibility and disappearance. And still, she loved him. That too must be said. There is one account, disputed but persistent, of Cleopatra slipping into Caesarion's chamber during a thunderstorm, not as queen, but simply as mother. She sat by the window as he slept, her hand resting on the back of his chair, her eyes not on the lightning but on the slow rise and fall of his breath. And in that stillness, she may have realized that all of Egypt, all of Rome, all the shifting alliances and long-sketched borders amounted to nothing if she could not find a way to let that breath continue. And perhaps, for a moment, she allowed herself to wish that he had been born into another world, a quieter one without maps drawn in conquest, or names weighted by lineage, or gods that demanded perfection. A world where a boy could simply be a boy. But no such world existed for CAESARION. She had tried to build it, and now she had to dismantle it piece by piece in order to protect what little might remain. There was no more space to hide him in the palace, and there was no more time. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. In every empire, there are spaces that are built not to be used, but to be seen. Thrones, in particular, often function more as symbols than as seats. They exist to anchor stories, to convince people that someone, somewhere, holds the weight of power even if the figure meant to sit upon them is nowhere near. For CAESARION, the throne prepared in his name became exactly that, a monument to potential, carefully preserved in the shadows, polished regularly, guarded constantly, and never truly occupied. It sat at the far end of the ceremonial chamber, beneath a ceiling inlaid with gold leaf and lapis lazuli stars. The throne was elevated, not ostentatiously, but with just enough height to signal reverence. The platform itself was flanked by carved lion's paws, a visual echo of earlier dynasties, and draped with linen dyed in Tyrian purple. At a glance, it might have looked complete, the final seat of a divine line, awaiting only the rightful heir. But to those who served within the palace, it was something else entirely, an empty center around which everything else orbited. CAESARION had seen it many times. He was brought into the chamber during rehearsals, diplomatic receptions, and seasonal rituals. Sometimes, he stood beside it. Other times, a few careful paces back, but never upon it. Not even during private moments, not even as a boy curious to test the feel of its weight beneath him. There were no games of pretend, no stolen moments of rebellion. The absence was too formal, too present. He knew, even at a young age, that the throne was not made for comfort. It was made to prove he existed, without letting him fully become what it implied. And so the throne became a kind of double silence, a silence of purpose, because it affirmed a claim no one dared voice aloud, and a silence of use, because to occupy it would mean acknowledging a future that no longer felt promised. Cleopatra understood this deeply. She continued to maintain the throne's appearance with ceremonial precision. The cushions were fluffed and smoothed, the gold filigree polished until it gleamed under torchlight. Each week, the floor beneath it was swept by a specific servant whose hands were known to leave no streaks. But behind that ritual was a slow, painful erosion. Fewer ambassadors inquired about the boy's succession. Fewer priests referred to his divine heritage, and the throne, which had once been introduced to visitors as a visual confirmation of dynastic continuity, was increasingly referred to only in passing, as part of the room's decor, not its destiny. Still, Cleopatra preserved it, not out of delusion, but from a refusal to surrender to the shape history had begun to impose. It was her last architectural hope, a visible act of resistance against the narrowing of possibility. She may have known that CAESARION would never sit on it, but so long as the throne remained, the idea of him ruling, of him being remembered as someone who could have ruled, would remain as well. For CAESARION, however, the throne took on a more complicated meaning. As he grew, it ceased to inspire awe and began to take on the qualities of a puzzle that refused to be solved. It was a thing that symbolized him without asking his consent. It was placed in the center of a hall designed to elevate identity, yet it quietly undermined his presence by being eternally untouched. It demanded that he recognize his role, but not fulfill it, that he prepare for it, but never approach. It was there to remind him of everything he could not claim not yet, perhaps not ever. There's a kind of psychological weight that accumulates when one is raised around an object that carries your future in its shape, but denies you access to it. It begins to erode the boundary between inheritance and absence. You don't simply grow into adulthood, you grow around a lack. And CAESARION, already trained in the art of stillness, began to see the throne less as an endpoint and more as a mirror one that reflected what others wanted from him without ever revealing what he wanted for himself. On certain evenings, after the chamber had been cleared and the guards had withdrawn to their corners, he would walk the perimeter of the hall in silence, pausing for a moment near the platform but never ascending. The torches would flicker softly behind him, their light throwing long, distorted shadows across the lion's paws. There was no performance, no practice of authority. He did not rehearse commands or royal decrees. He simply stood and observed not the throne, but the room around it, the walls that had witnessed so many intentions fray into compromise. Perhaps he wondered how long an empty seat could hold meaning, or whether a symbol, maintained too long without use, eventually collapses into ornament. His mother never pushed him toward it. That, too, is worth noting. She did not urge him to sit, to declare, to perform. Cleopatra, whose political life had been built on performance, refrained from using her son as a prop in her final campaigns. She may have known the danger was too great. Or perhaps, more intimately, she knew that no child raised beneath two sons can be expected to grow in one direction. The Roman envoys noticed the absence, of course. They reported back with careful phrasing, noting the reverent restraint shown in Alexandria's court. They interpreted the lack of coronation as a sign of hesitation, or weakness, or unresolved strategy. But what they failed to grasp was that absence, in this case, was its own form of presence. The boy's non-crowning was not a retreat, it was an act of defiance. To maintain the throne without claiming it was to deny Rome the narrative it desired, that the child was nothing, that his line had ended, that his mother's vision was undone. Instead, Cleopatra left the seat exactly where it had always been, not abandoned, not forgotten, but suspended, waiting in a silence that was not surrender, but refusal. And perhaps this is the cruelest paradox of all. The throne was not empty because CAESARION lacked the will or the right. It was empty because history, in its haste to move forward, had no patience for ambiguity. If anything in this stayed behind, you can leave something below. Or not. It still counts. This was Boring History Nights. Empires don't always destroy what they fear. Sometimes they erase it. It's quieter that way. More effective. More final. Fire can be argued with, it leaves traces. Ashes. The bitter smell of memory. But forgetting. That's something different. It's a clean silence. One without evidence. One that doesn't need to justify itself. This is what happened to CAESARION, not immediately, not violently, but systematically, over weeks and months, until the boy who had once carried two empires in his blood was spoken of less and less, not with condemnation, not with hatred, simply with absence. And for an empire that was trying to establish a new era, a new name, and a new myth, absence was enough. By the time Octavian had begun consolidating power, there was no room left for stories that didn't serve him. The assassination of Julius Caesar had left a political vacuum not just in the halls of Rome, but in its imagination. Whoever could fill that space with a convincing version of the future would rule, and Octavian was ruthless in how he shaped that version. He didn't just fight rivals, he buried them under language. He called himself Caesar's adopted son, the one chosen, the one legitimized not by birth but by will. And that phrasing mattered. It made loyalty a contract, not an accident. It made his power seem deliberate, as though the gods themselves had preferred him. CAESARION, on the other hand, represented something messier, a bloodline inherited, not chosen, a child produced out of alliance, or affection, or ambition, depending on whom you asked. His existence made Octavian's claim feel contingent, and so he had to be forgotten. Not killed, not yet, not officially. First, the groundwork had to be laid. The letters stopped being answered. The Eastern emissaries who had once inquired about Cleopatra's son began receiving colder receptions. Senators stopped mentioning him in speeches. Roman historians, always alert to which way the wind was turning, began writing versions of recent events in which the boy barely appeared. If he was mentioned at all, it was in the language of uncertainty, alleged, supposed, rumored, and in a world built on archives and scrolls, where future generations would know only what they were told. This subtle reframing was the beginning of erasure. Back in Alexandria, Caesarion would not have known this process in detail, but he would have felt it not as a sudden rupture, but as a shift in weight. Fewer messengers arrived bearing Roman seals. Fewer dignitaries asked to meet him. The letters he had once watched his mother send out across the sea now returned unopened, or did not return at all. Conversations with his tutors drifted toward abstraction. The lessons became more philosophical, less political. The maps on the wall remained, but their borders felt increasingly hypothetical. And though he was still spoken to as a prince, he began to realize that no one around him was preparing him for a crown anymore. It's unclear exactly when Cleopatra understood the full extent of the forgetting. It might have come gradually, through the tone of returned correspondence, through the behavior of once reliable allies who now hesitated to meet her gaze. Or perhaps she knew the moment she saw a Roman envoy speak of the future of Egypt, without referencing her son at all, as if the throne could pass into history without his name attached to it. She did not rage, at least not outwardly. Cleopatra was too practiced in restraint, too fluent in the performance of control, but she adjusted. That was her strength. When power shifted, she shifted with it not to escape, but to endure. And so, she began to move differently through the palace. Her footsteps grew slower, not from defeat, but from calculation. Her conversations with Caesarion became more elliptical, filled with metaphors and questions instead of instructions. She didn't explain what was happening. She didn't speak of Rome's decision. She simply prepared him not for battle, but for vanishing. It wasn't an abdication, it was a transformation. And perhaps Caesarion, who had grown up in the presence of ceremony and silence, understood better than anyone what it meant to become invisible while standing still. There is a particular cruelty in being erased while still alive, to feel the outlines of your name growing thinner, the meaning behind your presence fading from those who once swore to protect it. To walk through a room and feel not animosity, but indifference. And it is this indifference, not hatred, that kills most legacies. History rarely burns its enemies. It simply rewrites around them. Still, within Alexandria, there were those who remembered, the palace servants, the scribes, the guards who had watched him grow. They continued their roles not out of duty alone, but out of quiet loyalty. They maintained his schedule, spoke his titles in full, greeted him with deference, but even they could not protect his future. They could only preserve the shape of a life that Rome had decided no longer needed to exist. And somewhere, among the silent columns and swept courtyards, Caesarion began to prepare for the possibility that history would not remember him as a king, not as a ruler, perhaps not even as a son, but as a question. And this unresolvable question would linger longer than any marble statue, because when Rome forgets something, it never fully disappears. It becomes a rumor, a story, a whisper in the space where certainty once stood. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. There is a particular weight that follows a person once the world suspects they might matter. Not when they act, not when they speak, but before. when they're still too young to understand the vocabulary of power, yet old enough to feel its echo in the way people begin to move differently around them. For Caesarion, that shift was subtle at first, a hesitation before someone answered him, a delay before a door was opened, the polite bow that lingered a fraction too long to be genuine. It wasn't that people feared him, not in the traditional sense. They feared what he might become. They feared what his name, if spoken too clearly in the wrong setting, could set in motion. And so, long before he reached an age where most princes are instructed in matters of courtly influence or military order, he was already under quiet observation. But these weren't the eyes of teachers, nor of mentors. These were the eyes of Rome, distant, deliberate, and cold. You wouldn't see them if you weren't trained to look. They never stood too close. They never asked questions directly. But they were there among the scribes who had arrived from abroad to assist with translations, among the engineers sent to inspect port architecture, among the minor diplomats who attended every public appearance and took far too many notes. They wore courtesy like a mask. They arrived with gifts and stayed too long. They offered support in vague phrases and watched with the kind of attention that pretends to be respect but hides calculation just beneath the surface. Caesarion, still just a boy, noticed this change without entirely understanding its meaning. He asked fewer questions as the years went on, not because he had grown incurious, but because he sensed that even questions had begun to echo. Every word he spoke might be repeated, might be twisted, might be taken as evidence of intent. His world had become an amphitheater where the audience was never visible, yet always listening. Cleopatra noticed the shift as well, and while she had always known that Rome would never leave them entirely alone, she had hoped, perhaps naively, that distance would delay their interference. But what she saw now unsettled her. It wasn't invasion by force. It was infiltration by presence. The kind that doesn't knock at the door, but simply waits until you forget to close it. Her palace, once the heart of a proud and independent kingdom, had become transparent, not physically, but in spirit. The walls no longer held their secrets the way they used to. She tightened security, of course. Guards were reassigned. Visitors were vetted more harshly. Even servants who had worked in the palace for years were suddenly asked for family histories. But she also understood something deeper. When an empire as large as Rome wants to know something, it doesn't ask permission. It simply listens until the silence breaks on its own. And so she turned inward, adjusting the rhythms of court life. Caesarion's movements became more structured. His schedule, once flexible and rich with intellectual curiosity, was pared down to essentials. Lessons were conducted indoors, away from open windows. Walks were scheduled for twilight, and always accompanied by guards who knew not only how to defend, but how to disappear if needed. The goal was not to imprison him. It was to dull the outline of his life so that it no longer cast shadows large enough to draw notice. But of course, the more she tried to protect him, the more obvious it became that he was worth protecting, and that, in itself, was a risk. The Roman observers grew more focused. Their letters became more pointed. They asked not about policy or diplomacy, but about health. Was the boy well? Was he growing quickly? What languages did he speak fluently? Who were his tutors? Was he being seen more often at ceremonies or less? These were not casual inquiries. They were measurements. Rome was taking stock not just of the present, but of the future it might have to contend with. And in these subtle, clinical evaluations, a strange fear began to crystallize not in Alexandria, but in Rome itself. The fear was not that Caesarion had already taken power. It was that he might survive long enough to learn how, that he might one day rise not just as a prince of Egypt, but as the final argument against Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy. Because unlike Octavian, Caesarion was not adopted. He was not legitimized by decree. He was born, and birth, even without endorsement, carries its own dangerous kind of authority. There are records partial. fragmented of correspondence between Roman generals and senators from this time. They do not explicitly order Caesarion's death, but they mention containment. They suggest neutralizing the potential of future claims. They discuss the delicate matter of succession in foreign territories. These are the phrases of empire, crafted to sound reasonable, carefully emptied of blood. Cleopatra, for her part, began to work through alternatives. There were ideas of sending Caesarion away to India, perhaps, or to Ethiopia, or to a monastic school hidden beyond the hills of Thebes. None of these plans gained traction. None of them felt viable, because to remove him entirely would be to abandon him, and to leave him in Alexandria was to risk watching him disappear, not physically, but historically piece by piece, under the pressure of foreign eyes. And so, trapped between two impossibilities, she chose what so many leaders before her had chosen, to keep moving forward while pretending she still controlled the pace. Caesarion, meanwhile, watched. That was his greatest skill by then, watching without reacting, listening without recording. He became a boy fluent in patience, a boy who understood the cost of being misinterpreted. Even the servants grew quieter around him. They addressed him as Highness, with full deference, but with lowered eyes, not from disrespect, but from fear, not of him, but of what his name might attract. He would sit by the window some days, overlooking the harbor, watching the Roman ships dock and unload. To any observer, he looked serene, but inwardly, he was counting. Not the ships, but the time they stayed. He marked their patterns. He remembered the faces of the men who disembarked. He knew that observation was not one-sided, and yet, despite the knowledge, he said nothing. He remained, as always, the prince who existed without insisting, the one everyone watched, but few ever truly saw. It's a strange thing, to be studied like a threat before you've done anything at all. It's stranger still to realize that being harmless is no longer enough. There are certain names that linger in a space long after the person who carries them has left, not as sound, not even as memory, but as tension. Caesarion became that kind of presence, even in the polished marble halls of Rome, hundreds of miles from Alexandria. His name was not spoken freely, but its echo shaped the decisions of men who claimed they had no reason to fear him. And yet, their caution betrayed them, because no one invests so much effort into forgetting something unless, deep down, they believe it might return. It wasn't his deeds that troubled them. He was still only a boy. He had never fought a battle, never made a proclamation, never led a rebellion. It was the possibility of him that unsettled, a living contradiction to the story they were trying to cement. Because while Octavian could call himself Caesar's rightful heir by adoption, Caesarion was the physical embodiment of what Rome was trying to erase, an alternative future, one not born in Rome, not shaped by Senate decree, but inherited through blood and declared by a queen who refused to speak softly. And in every chamber where Octavian's advisors gathered, poring over ledgers, troop positions, provincial loyalties, Caesarion's absence was present. He had become a strategic variable, a silent factor in every political equation. No one said it outright, but each move they made carried the weight of what to do if the boy survived, if Egypt rallied behind him, if the myth of Caesar reborn grew stronger than the machinery of Roman legitimacy. There were whispers of allegiances forming along the eastern frontier, governors who had not yet declared for Octavian, military men who still hesitated to write off the memory of Julius Caesar. These murmurs didn't become headlines in marble tablets, but they bled into every strategy. The eastern provinces were watching, and they were waiting, not for Cleopatra, for her son. Even within Rome's own walls, the fear was not that Caesarion would appear with an army, but that he wouldn't have to, that he might one day be summoned not by force, but by narrative as a rightful heir, a final thread of divine will unbroken by assassination or adoption. And that Rome, so hungry to believe in its own order, might listen. In private meetings, Octavian's men called this the shadow problem. They didn't mean it poetically. They meant it tactically, because Caesarion, without raising a finger, without leaving his mother's side, was casting a long and inconvenient darkness across the vision of a stable, unified Rome. His continued existence forced them to acknowledge that the story of Julius Caesar did not end at the Ides of March, nor even in the Senate's ritualized mourning. It had continued, quietly, in a boy whose face no Roman had seen, but whose name could still disrupt everything they were building. This is why the conversations about him never felt quite grounded. There was always a vagueness, a reluctance to attach concrete decisions to his name. Instead, they cloaked their discussions in abstractions: the Eastern situation, Alexandrian succession, foreign continuity. He was a child, yes, but more dangerously, he was a symbol that had not yet expired. And symbols, once they take root, are notoriously hard to dislodge. Back in Alexandria, Caesarion could feel this tension, though no one explained it to him directly. He saw it in the way his mother held her scrolls more tightly, in the way she stopped correcting the tutors when they avoided political subjects. He noticed when the guards around him changed more frequently. He understood that the stories they used to read aloud, tales of divine sons ascending to thrones, were no longer told, not because they had become irrelevant, but because they had become too relevant. And still, no one lied to him. There were no grand deceptions, no speeches of false hope. Cleopatra was too intelligent, and perhaps too weary, to give him illusions. What she gave him instead was preparation, not for coronation, but for contingency. She taught him how to speak with precision, how to listen without reacting, how to mask his thoughts without losing his conviction. She understood, more clearly than anyone, that if Caesarion was to survive, he would have to carry not just a legacy, but an ambiguity to be seen as a boy and forgotten as a king, all while retaining the knowledge of what he could have been. It is difficult to live with that kind of awareness, to understand your place in history not as actor, but as interruption, to walk through a palace where every tapestry proclaims your lineage, while knowing that none of it may endure, to feel your footsteps echo in a hall whose marble was quarried for your inheritance, while understanding that your name might be the first thing removed once Rome decides it has no use for it. Caesarion walked those halls daily. He did not complain. He did not argue. But he remembered. And in remembering, he preserved something that no Roman decree could erase: not a claim, not a throne, but a clarity. That his life, whether acknowledged or buried, would remain a problem for those who depended on clean narratives. He understood that history, when it speaks too confidently, often leaves behind the most important truths. And so, quietly, he prepared to outlive the version of himself that Rome had already decided to forget. If you stood in those marble halls now, centuries later, you might see only stone. But if you listen carefully, if you allow the silence to stretch a little further than comfort allows, you might notice it, the trace of a shadow that was never cast, yet never left. There is a moment in every life when childhood begins to recede, not in a clean line, but in fragments. For most, it slips away unnoticed, buried beneath the gradual accumulation of responsibilities. But for Caesarion, the transition arrived more like erosion, not through growth, but through removal. People stopped asking him questions that did not serve a purpose. Play disappeared from the corners of his schedule. Even affection began to feel rehearsed. Somewhere between 14 and 15, he stopped being treated as a boy, yet he was never quite allowed to be a man. Instead, he became a symbol. Symbols are difficult things to carry, especially when you are still growing into your own name. They are less forgiving than identities, less stable than titles. Once you become one, people no longer look at you, they look through you, toward the idea you represent. And in Caesarion's case, that idea was already too heavy. He was the child of gods. Some said the living bridge between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. between Rome and Egypt, between history and its next chapter. Others called him a mistake, an accident of legacy. To Octavian's supporters, he was a threat that dared not be allowed to mature. To those who loved him, he was a child standing on the edge of a stage he hadn't asked to walk across. But to the world beyond Alexandria, Caesarion had ceased to be personal. He was no longer just a name, he was potential, sharpened by time and myth. And potential, when feared, becomes dangerous. Cleopatra knew this better than anyone. She had spent her life shaping narratives, bending perception like reeds in the Nile wind. But what had once worked in her favor, theatrical diplomacy, divine lineage, spectacle as governance, had begun to sour in the eyes of her rivals. Rome was changing. It no longer found poetry in dynastic performance. It found suspicion, and the presence of her son, once a compelling vision of unity, had begun to serve as a reminder of the old world Rome now sought to overwrite. She tried to shield him from this knowledge, but she could not hide the way her voice tightened when Rome was mentioned. She could not disguise the letters that arrived, sealed in wax too red, too frequently. She could not explain why certain officials no longer visited, nor why the courtiers, who once laughed too loudly around the boy, now kept their mirth measured and their opinions neutral. The court had become careful, and Caesarion, young though he was, recognized the change for what it was: a retreat not from politics, but from him. He never said so aloud. He never asked why the rituals were quieter now, why the statues bore his likeness less frequently, why the streets no longer chanted his name during festivals. He knew the answers, and silence required no confirmation. But within him, a different kind of awareness began to form, not bitterness, not fear, but a deep, steady stillness, as though he had begun to understand that the only way to endure a life that was no longer his own was to let it pass through him without resistance. And in that stillness, he listened to the scribes muttering behind closed doors, to the guards who spoke too freely when they assumed he had fallen asleep, to the patterns in his mother's footsteps when she paced past midnight. He noticed which names were spoken with tension. He heard which provinces were mentioned with unease. He understood, eventually, that Rome was not simply watching, but preparing, and that he was the pivot point around which the next wave of action might turn. What did it mean to be born into a story that others had already begun writing, without you to carry a legacy whose weight was shaped not by your deeds, but by your blood? These questions did not arrive to Caesarion as philosophy. They arrived as breath, as posture, as the quiet way his life began to contract around an expectation he could neither fulfill nor escape. He began to withdraw, not dramatically, and not from defiance, but from necessity. His days remained ordered. He read, he studied, he walked with his tutors, but his expressions grew less animated. His conversations, once filled with curiosity, grew tempered by caution, not because he had stopped wondering, but because he understood that even wonder, when overheard, could be weaponized. Those closest to him began to remark upon the change. His tone had matured, they said. He was more composed, but Cleopatra saw through it. She recognized the defense mechanism for what it was: the shaping of a person around absence. A son who was still very much alive, but was learning how to be remembered only as a symbol. She tried to reach him not by words, which had become too fragile, but by presence. She sat with him more often, unspoken minutes stretching between them like reed mats in the sun. They shared bread without discussing politics. They watched the horizon without naming the ships that passed. And in those moments, a softer truth emerged that both of them were being reduced, not by failure, but by the narrowing of a world no longer interested in complexity. To Rome, Cleopatra was no longer a queen. She was a complication, and Caesarion was no longer a boy, he was a scenario, one to be closed before it could evolve. The tragedy, of course, is that Caesarion never ruled. He never issued decrees, never commanded armies, never stood in a forum to plead his right. He remained on the periphery, alive but distant, visible but silent. And yet, it was precisely this silence that frightened his enemies, because in the absence of action, he remained undefined. And what cannot be defined cannot be controlled. To become a symbol too soon is to lose the right to become anything else. Caesarion knew this, and still, he stood in the corridors of power, not as a claimant, not as a prince making demands, but as a young man trying to remember which parts of himself had not yet been translated into political risk. In the moments between obligations, he tried to remember the smell of papyrus ink, the shape of his mother's voice when she wasn't instructing, the softness of the Nile wind before it carried the weight of history on its back. He had not given Rome a reason to fear him, but they feared him nonetheless. And fear, once named, rarely walks backward. There comes a point when a ruler's greatest weapon is no longer her armies, her treasury, or even her alliances, but her silence. Cleopatra understood this better than any statesman who had ever walked marble halls or raised a goblet in toast to empire. Words, once wielded to dazzle, to disarm, to rule, had begun to feel brittle. In the final stretch of her reign, with Caesarion still breathing and Rome moving closer by the hour, she turned to the one strategy no one could easily counter. She stopped speaking where it mattered most. To the world beyond Alexandria, this retreat looked like dignity, perhaps even surrender. But in truth, it was a final, sharpened act of defiance. Because to speak of Caesarion to publicly insist on his birthright, his legitimacy, his bloodline would have been to place a mark upon him that could not be removed. The louder she declared him a son of Caesar, the faster Rome would have hastened to erase him. And so she chose not to declare at all. She folded her ambition inward, let the public ceremonies grow quieter, and permitted the memory of her son's ascension to remain just that, a possibility unacted upon. But this wasn't abandonment. It was protection. The kind only a mother who has known power's cruelty could offer. To silence Caesarion's future was, in a strange way, to extend it. And to pretend she had no more plans for him was to leave him a slim corridor through which survival might slip. Those around her noticed the change. Her once vibrant court, known for its clever intrigues, its bilingual performances, its calculated decadence, began to lose its sheen. Ministers who once lobbied for favor found themselves dismissed. Foreign envoys, expecting a parade of allegories and incense, were met instead with restraint. She gave fewer interviews to historians, fewer commands to artists, fewer answers to her own advisors. Her gaze lingered longer on Caesarion now, especially when she thought he wasn't watching. And when she did speak to him, it was with a softness that held something new, not defeat, but finality. It's easy to mistake her stillness for despair. But Cleopatra was never one to collapse inwardly. She did not stop speaking out of fear. She stopped because she finally understood that every word she offered about her son became another thread Rome could follow. They didn't need evidence. They needed suggestion. And she would not be the one to give it to them. In private, she still taught him, not in the formal sense, not the lessons of statecraft or rhetoric those had already been instilled. These were different teachings, quieter, more layered. She spoke of history's silence, of how the scrolls favored the victors, and how truth could hide in margins. She taught him how to breathe when he wanted to argue, how to disappear inside a room while still watching everything, and, above all, how to carry a legacy so delicately that it would not wake until it was ready to be heard, because that is what Caesarion had become, a sleeping claim, a name waiting for time to decide whether it would be written in gold or buried in sand. And yet, for all her efforts to shield him with silence, Cleopatra remained surrounded by noise. The sound of Rome's consolidation echoed like boots on polished tile. Octavian was not merely posturing, He was building a narrative, piece by careful piece. His messengers made certain the world knew he was Caesar's rightful heir, that he held the legal will, the adoption, the Senate's nod. And while he avoided naming Caesarion directly, his silences were more pointed than Cleopatra's. In Rome, rumors were cultivated like crops, a boy raised in luxury, calling himself King of Kings, planning revenge, gathering legions in Alexandria. These stories were not verified, but verification was never their purpose. Their goal was preemption. Octavian didn't need to prove Caesarion was dangerous. He merely needed enough people to believe he might be. In this climate, Cleopatra's silence was not just a mother's shield, it was a battlefield. Every day she did not name her son as successor. Every ceremony she let pass without elevating him. Every audience she held, where he was absent, these were not lapses. They were calculated absences. By reducing his presence in the public eye, she attempted to cut off Rome's momentum. If there was no coronation, then there was no usurper. If there was no declaration, then there was no threat. But this kind of governance comes at a cost. Within Alexandria, the people noticed. The same populace that had once cheered for Caesarion, throwing dates and petals in his path, began to grow uncertain. Without affirmations, rumors took root. Was the queen abandoning her son? Had Rome already made its decision? Would there be no heir after all? Public trust is fragile, and the silence meant to preserve one life slowly eroded the belief in a future for the entire dynasty. Still, Cleopatra did not shift. Her gamble was absolute. She would give up the narrative to preserve the boy. But history, as always, had other plans. For all her care, all her caution, all the rehearsed quiet she wove into the walls of her palace, there remained one truth she could not rewrite. Caesarion was still alive. He was still her son. He was still the child of Julius Caesar. And no silence, however skillful, could erase that fact from the minds of those determined to end it. When Octavian began to move, not with swords, but with declarations, she felt the end coming. Not in thunder, but in echo, the kind that follows a sentence long after it has been spoken. She did not panic. She did not rally her troops. She simply prepared. There would be one last ceremony, but not for the world. It would not take place in public. It would not include heralds or trumpets or gilded statues. It would be a farewell not of mourning, but of instruction, a final teaching, a final act of maternal rule. She told Caesarion nothing of the coming storm, only what he needed to remember: how to disappear, how to wait, how to carry a crown that no one had yet placed on his head. Because sometimes the greatest legacy a ruler can give is not a throne, but the chance to outlive it. They say that legacies are written in stone, but Cleopatra understood that the truest legacies, the ones that outlast the noise of conquests and proclamations, are the ones buried in sand, not because they are forgotten, but because they must be hidden not from memory, but from destruction. And so, as the curtain fell on the last days of her reign, she turned not to monuments, but to concealment. To those on the outside, the palace still breathed in rhythm. The guards still changed shift with military precision. The kitchens still smoked at dawn, and the scribes still copied decrees. But within the heart of the royal household, things were shifting not visibly, not dramatically, but with the quiet decisiveness of a queen who no longer ruled by command, but by preparation. Cleopatra had made peace with the fact that she would not be able to defend her dynasty through strength. What remained was strategy and secrecy. She had spent decades mastering the art of perception, learning which masks to wear, which gestures to let linger, which names to speak in public and which to reserve for shadows. But in those final days, she abandoned the theater. There were no more performances, no more illusions of control. What mattered now was what could survive after her, not the statues, not the coins, not even the myths. What mattered was Caesarion. But to preserve him, she had to erase him. It was a contradiction so painful it almost unmade her. All her life, she had constructed images of Egypt, of sovereignty, of herself, only to be forced now into unmaking the one thing that might have secured her place in history. Not by denying his importance, but by denying his existence. She couldn't afford to let Rome capture him as a symbol. She couldn't let them march him through their streets like a trophy, as they had done to so many others. Caesarion's blood was not merely a lineage, it was a threat disguised as inheritance, and Rome would not tolerate its ambiguity. So she moved quietly. She sent envoys not with instructions, but with silences coded absences, subtle omissions in letters that only the right reader would interpret. The boy would leave, but not as a prince, not even as a refugee. He would vanish in a way that could not be traced, not on ships with banners, but on foot, disguised as someone he never imagined he'd become ordinary. Of course, such a departure required more than timing. It required the burial of evidence. Cleopatra began to dismantle the public record not by destroying it, but by altering it just enough to confuse. Official proclamations referencing Caesarion became less frequent, and those that did appear hinted at illness, reclusion, or philosophical retreat. She allowed rumors to bloom, even encouraged them, that the boy had been sent away for study, that he had gone mad, that he had died young, quietly, like so many others. Every version served its purpose to distract, to confuse, to dissolve. She erased, too, the smaller things, the paintings, the dedications, the songs composed in his name. Not all of them. That would have been suspicious. Just enough to dull the trail. The palace began to feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by deliberate absences. Rooms that once belonged to him stood undisturbed, their furniture rearranged or removed. His tutors were dismissed one by one. His scent began to fade from the linens. His laughter, once heard in the courtyard during the afternoon, was replaced by the still rustling of reeds and wind. And yet, none of this erasure felt like betrayal. It was an act of love, measured in restraint. In the privacy of their last conversation, she didn't weep. Cleopatra had always known how to grieve without spectacle. She simply placed her hand over his and told him that power was not always worn as a crown, that some kings were made not by what they inherited, but by what they survived. She didn't tell him where to go, only how to be, how to walk as if he didn't matter, how to speak as if he knew nothing, how to wait, silently, until history forgot to keep looking. Caesarion did not argue. He was too young to be ready, but too old to be protected. And somewhere, perhaps, he already understood that the road ahead would not end in restoration, that he was not leaving to reclaim a throne, but to escape becoming a warning carved into someone else's column. The dawn of his departure was not marked by ceremony. There was no procession, no parting gifts, no songs sung to the gods. He left with a satchel, a handful of coins, and a face that had been trained not to be remembered. No guards accompanied him, only shadows. No horses waited, only dust. Cleopatra watched him disappear from a high window, her fingers resting against cool stone. She didn't wave. She didn't pray. She simply stood, long enough for the moment to root itself in memory, long enough to let herself believe that the son she had raised would now have the one thing she never did, a life outside of legend. What she did next remains shrouded in speculation. Some say she began writing letters, not to allies, but to future generations, burying fragments of her truth in scrolls sealed beneath temple floors. Others claim she walked through the palace chambers alone, touching each doorway, whispering farewells in a language no longer spoken. There were no more feasts, no more meetings with generals, only the steady disintegration of everything she had once built. And in that slow unbuilding, Cleopatra achieved something few rulers ever have. She turned her downfall into a burial not of her own name, but of Rome's victory. because Rome would never find the child. They would march, they would search, they would proclaim, but what they would find was a palace emptied of heirs, a legacy blurred beyond use. They would raise their banners over sand, over marble, over silence, and in time, they would claim that Egypt had fallen because it was weak. But Cleopatra knew better. She hadn't let the empire die. She had hidden it where no army could reach, in a name no longer spoken, in a boy no longer visible, in a crown that slipped into sand, not to be lost but to wait. There is a particular kind of emptiness that only palaces understand, the kind left behind not by defeat, but by design. Long after the world believes the story has ended, long after the last torch has burned down its wick, and the last sandal has stepped across the marble, a throne can remain, not as a seat of power, but as a symbol too dangerous to occupy and too sacred to destroy. This is the throne Cleopatra left behind, not shattered, not claimed, but suspended, in a silence so precise it became unbearable to those who dared to look at it. The room itself was intact. The columns still stood in their perfect symmetry, painted in ochre and lapis, worn only slightly by the fingers of wind. The floor was swept daily, not out of duty, but out of habit, the rituals of maintenance continuing long after the purpose had been lost. In the center, the throne waited, not draped in cloth, not adorned in jewels, not even elevated on a dais. It simply existed, neither full nor empty, and that was what made it terrifying. For to acknowledge its vacancy was to acknowledge that it had been deliberately left so, not usurped, not neglected, but abandoned with the precision of someone who knew that the most dangerous thing to leave behind was not a rebellion, but a question, who was meant to sit there. No one could answer, not openly, because to speak Caesarion's name now was to resurrect the very threat Rome had tried to bury, a bloodline too inconvenient, a child too symbolic, a legacy too stubborn to erase completely. Even Octavian, in his march through Egypt's corpse, chose to ignore the throne rather than repurpose it. He had no desire to claim it. He wanted it forgotten, yet he could not destroy it, because to do so would be to confirm that it had once mattered. So the throne remained, a paradox in polished stone, guarded not by soldiers but by absence. Visitors to the palace now fewer, mostly Roman dignitaries and bureaucrats with no real affection for the land, avoided the room instinctively. When they entered it, they spoke in clipped tones, as if sound itself was unwelcome. Some believed it cursed, others simply found it unsettling, because even without its queen, without her son, without even a court to validate its importance, the space still carried the weight of intention. Cleopatra had never truly explained her choices, and that was the genius of it. In refusing to narrate the end of her reign, she left it unclaimed, a gap in history that no victor could confidently fill. Octavian could proclaim victory, could annex the territory, could plunder its libraries and temples, but he could not rewrite what had not been written. The final chapter of Cleopatra's Egypt remained unspoken, and in that silence, it became immune to conquest. This was not an accident. It was her final act of control. The scholars who came later, those who tried to make sense of the gap, who combed through fragmented papyri and translated half-burned scrolls, found themselves circling a void. There were mentions of Caesarion's escape, vague allusions to diplomatic shipments rerouted south, hushed entries in temple ledgers that hinted at large expenses with no listed recipient, but no proof, no declaration, no body, just a throne, conspicuously unclaimed. The people of Alexandria, too, played their part, whether out of loyalty, fear, or fatigue. They let the silence stand. Mothers no longer told their children stories of a boy king. Bards omitted him from their songs. Priests made offerings in his name only behind closed doors. Even graffiti, that most democratic of records, kept its distance. The collective memory of CAESARION did not vanish, it retreated, like a tide pulling far back from shore, gathering its strength out of sight. And so the throne became a relic, but not a ruin, a presence, not a past, every cobweb swept away from its legs, every scuff polished out of the floor beneath it, reinforced the idea that it was not finished, that something had been left on purpose, a statement not of absence, but of refusal. It is strange, perhaps, to imagine that silence can be political, but Cleopatra mastered it. She wielded it like others wielded armies. While Rome thundered with declarations and decrees, she spoke through what she withheld, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the throne room she left behind. There was no plaque, no inscription, no monument to explain what had happened there, or what had not. And yet the weight of unspoken truth pressed into the stone like a fossil. Visitors who lingered too long in the room reported a sensation they could not name, as if they were being watched, not by spirits, but by intention, as if the walls remembered something they weren't permitted to say. And still, the throne remained untouched. Even as the years passed, as the empire shifted and reshaped itself, as new governors came and went, no one dared turn the throne into a chair. No one placed scrolls upon it or leaned a staff against its arm, even when the room was repurposed briefly, absurdly as an archive or a ceremonial hall. The throne was left alone. It was a scar no one wanted to probe. For the Romans, it was easier to pretend it was decorative, an artifact of a strange and overly dramatic queen, whose death had been her final gesture of vanity. But this explanation never sat comfortably. It sounded too tidy, too convenient, and the discomfort it stirred only deepened the silence. Eventually, the room was sealed, not by order, but by exhaustion. Let it sit, they said. Let it gather dust. Let it fade. But Cleopatra had never believed in dust. She believed in strategy, in legacy, in the manipulation of perception, and she had known exactly what she was doing. The throne was not meant to be sat on. It was meant to be noticed, then avoided, remembered, then denied. It was a reminder that power, once withdrawn, does not vanish, it lingers. It shapes the silence left behind. In time, the palace would fall. Earthquakes, salt air, and the long erosion of empire would collapse the walls. The harbor would swallow its edges, and history would rewrite itself around what could no longer be seen. But for centuries, and even now, in fragments the throne exists in stories. Not the ones Rome wanted to tell, but the ones that survived in sand and whisper. And if you ever stand before it, whether in a museum display or a half-ruined hall, you will feel it not the glory of rule, but the terrifying precision of a ruler who knew exactly what silence could do. Because some thrones were never meant to be taken, only remembered. It was never just about death. For Cleopatra, death had long ceased to be the enemy. In her world, a world of alliances that soured in the sun and brothers who turned into rivals, death was not the worst thing that could happen. The worst was erasure. The slow, meticulous redrafting of one's name by those who never understood it. The hollowing of a life into a story someone else could sell. And so, when the hour came, she did not fight to escape death. She fought to write it. The chamber was not dim, not cold, not cloaked in superstition. It was, in fact, absurdly ordinary. There were no curses scrawled on the walls, no incense to mask the scent of fear. The air was clean, the linens freshly folded, the silence complete. It was a silence Cleopatra had arranged herself, not the desperate hush of someone cornered, but the curated stillness of someone who knew how to prepare a scene. She had prepared so many in her life. This one would be her final stage. She did not weep. Weeping was for those who believed they still had something to lose. Cleopatra had already surrendered her son to the sand, her city to Rome, her past to myth. What remained was her name, not the sound of it, but the meaning, and that She would not surrender easily. The poison was not exotic. It was not conjured from distant jungles or whispered by priests in riddles. It was studied, selected, and tested not once, but several times over. Cleopatra had ordered the trials herself, using condemned prisoners as subjects. She recorded each result with detachment, noting the speed, the visible effects, the dignity preserved or stripped. Her notes were precise, clinical, unsentimental, and through that cold arithmetic, she chose the one that worked quietly, a toxin not known for spectacle, but for certainty. Some say it was a snake. Others say it was a blend of opium, hemlock, and aconite. There are scrolls that speak of a vial, and others that describe an ointment laced into a comb. But none of that mattered as much as the outcome and the fact that it was hers, that no Roman hand delivered it, that no blade bore Octavian's fingerprints, that her end, unlike her life, was uncorrupted by politics. She was not alone. Though many later stories tried to place her that way, her attendants were there, Eris and Charmian, not as servants but as witnesses. They had dressed her, not in black, but in linen white, the color of birth and sacred offering. Her hair was arranged, not in mourning, but in memory of what she had once been: queen, mother, goddess. Not one of these identities had survived intact, but she insisted on honoring all three in her death. To those watching, this might have seemed ritualistic. To Cleopatra, it was strategic. Rome would not be allowed to present her corpse as a spectacle. There would be no parade, no triumphal gloating. She had seen what they did with vanquished royalty, how they bound them in chains and marched them through the streets like stolen treasure. She would not be caged. She would not be mocked in marble. She would become a question, not a prize. When the poison finally reached her bloodstream, it moved slowly, not out of mercy, but to ensure she remained aware of what she was leaving behind, aware that her name, so often used against her, was now hers to carry into death like a sealed document. She lay on the prepared bedding, her limbs composed, her breath steady. There was no panic. There was only the long exhale of someone who had orchestrated everything except the exact moment her heart would stop. And when it did, nothing changed at first. The room remained still. The sea did not rise. The marble did not crack. But something shifted, not in the palace, not even in Alexandria, but in the fabric of the empire itself. Because Rome had prepared for many outcomes. They had prepared for her capture, her execution, her exile. They had not prepared for her control over the one thing they always assumed belonged to them: the end. Octavian's arrival was hours too late. He had hoped to parade her through Rome, to kneel her beside his name, to make her a symbol of his supremacy. Instead, he found a room he could not enter comfortably, a death too precise to ridicule. He found her attendants still near her, still composed, as if her silence had spread into them as well. He could not punish her. He could not claim her. He could only record her, and even that, barely. The official reports described it as suicide dramatic, noble, but ultimately meaningless. They reduced her to a cautionary tale. They ignored the precision, the calculation, the performance. They turned her death into an inevitability instead of the deliberate, quiet rebellion it truly was. Because in dying, Cleopatra did what she had always done best. She refused to let Rome define her. She took from them the only thing they had left to take the narrative. And by doing so, she preserved a sliver of herself, not in stone, not in scripture, but in uncertainty. For centuries afterward, no one could agree on what happened in that room. Was it the asp? Was it poison? Did she truly choose it? Was she coerced? Was it peaceful? Was it painful? These questions echoed louder than any declaration of conquest, because a body can die, but a mystery lingers, and Cleopatra, ever the strategist, knew that a mystery is the most enduring kind of power. She did not live forever, but she did something more difficult. She made forgetting her impossible. And in the quiet hours of night, in libraries and lecture halls, in whispered debates and dusty texts, her final act still breathes. Not in the marble busts Rome carved without her permission, not in the statues that softened her features to fit their fantasies, but in the confusion, in the contradictions, in the stubborn refusal of her story to settle. This was the poison that carried her name, not venom, not hemlock, not death in the veins, but a question. A question that no conqueror has ever been able to answer without trembling. Who was she, really? And why, after all these centuries, do we still need to know? It was not the kind of tomb meant for discovery, not the sort of place built to awe or inspire, or to teach future generations the names of the dead. This tomb was something else entirely. A decision, buried beneath decisions. A space not designed to glorify, but to erase carefully, intentionally, and with the kind of silence that no empire dares disturb. And so Cleopatra was laid to rest, not in triumph, not even in legend, but in deliberate ambiguity. Her tomb, if it still stands, is more than a resting place. It is an answer withheld. The accounts conflict. Roman scribes wrote that she was buried with honor. Others suggest her tomb was constructed hastily, its materials borrowed from abandoned shrines and crumbling storage chambers of the temple district. Octavian, now Augustus, insisted she be buried beside Mark Antony. Some say it was a gesture of mercy. Others believe it was punishment, binding her in death to a man whose defeat made hers inevitable. But nothing is certain, because Octavian, for all his obsession with shaping narrative, allowed this one detail to slip into shadows. Perhaps that was the point. Rome wanted her gone, not remembered. A named corpse, yes, but not a place. No site of pilgrimage, no architecture to stir allegiance, no coordinates for poets to gather around and reimagine her spirit. Cleopatra's name could linger, but her body could not. That would have been too dangerous, too human. And yet, whispers persisted, that her tomb was magnificent, that it faced the sea, that it was shaped like a needle, or a flower, or the prow of a ship turned skyward, that her resting place was infused with the same perfumes she had once worn, that lapis lazuli adorned her crypt, and that her heart had been wrapped in linen marked with the symbol of Isis. There are maps drawn in ink so faint it looks like skin, with a dot near the ruins of Taposiris Magna. Some archaeologists today still follow those clues, half in hope, half in ritual, as if the search itself honors her more than any stone ever could. But the truth may be more elusive, because Cleopatra never needed a monument. She had already turned her body into a question. The tomb, whatever its form, did not matter. What mattered was that no one could be certain of it, that her presence remained speculative, suspended between soil and speculation. And through that uncertainty, she evaded something far more final than death appropriation. To die is one thing, to become a site is another. Octavian's new Rome was obsessed with spectacle. Temples, arches, forums, each monument another line in the story of imperial triumph. Conquered queens made excellent statues, as long as they couldn't speak. But Cleopatra could still speak. In whispers, in doubts, in every map that marked Alexandria but left a corner blank. There's a kind of terror that empires feel when they cannot finish a story. And Cleopatra, even in her grave, or perhaps especially in it, refused to give Rome the luxury of an ending. Her tomb was not merely hidden, it was withheld. And this too was an act of authorship. For Cleopatra had never ruled merely with gold or ships or seduction, as Rome liked to pretend. She ruled through absence, through calculated appearances, through the tension between what she allowed others to see and what she withheld. The body, the crown, the gaze these she offered selectively, a throne veiled in intellect. And so, in her final act, she took that strategy to its purest form. Her tomb became a mirror turned away from the world. No inscriptions, no entrance, no invitation. It is strange, in retrospect, that the greatest queen of Egypt's final resting place might be unfindable. But perhaps it isn't strange at all. Perhaps it's the final proof that she understood legacy better than any conqueror. Rome could flood her libraries. They could melt her coinage. They could marry her language to Latin and carve her features onto statuary that looked more Roman than African. But they could not point to a place and say, "Here, she ends." Because she did not end. She fractured. Into myth, into mistranslation, into obsession. And every attempt to find her is an admission that she still holds power. Modern historians sift through drone images, satellite data, seismic scans of coastal ruins. They use algorithms to reconstruct ancient shorelines, hoping to spot the architectural ghost of a temple buried under centuries of Nile silt and earthquake debris. Their tools are precise, their methods sophisticated, but the object of their search remains a queen who never played by the rules of visibility. She ruled a land of gods and grain, of prophecy and perfume. She knew how to make marble speak and how to silence a throne. And so her tomb, if it is even a tomb in the way we understand, is not simply a structure. It is an extension of her mind, one final room that does not respond to excavation, only to reverence. And what does it mean, really, to look for Cleopatra? It means more than bones, more than jewelry or cartouches. It means looking for the proof that a woman could outmaneuver the most powerful empire in the world, not by winning, but by refusing to lose on their terms. It means acknowledging that even in defeat, she controlled the narrative's pacing. She did not die in public. She did not allow her death to become theater. She walked into it, yes, but on her own cue. A tomb with no door is a message. It says you are not invited. It says this ending is not yours to explain. And in that, Cleopatra accomplished something almost no one in history has done. She remained sovereign after death, not politically, not militarily, but narratively, and that is why her story has never settled, why it resurfaces, again and again, in film, in opera, in rumor, why scholars grow frustrated, and why poets fall in love. Because the question still echoes beneath the sands, where is she? And beneath that, another question, softer, more dangerous, who was she, really? Cleopatra does not answer. She does not appear in marble or in ruins. She lets the search continue. Let them come, she seems to say. Let them dig and argue and guess. Let them assemble their stories like broken tiles on a floor she once walked across barefoot. But let them never be certain, because that uncertainty is the only monument she ever needed. A tomb that speaks not through stone, but through silence. A burial that cannot be claimed. A queen who never needed a door to leave behind a legacy that still bends history around her shape. There is something strange about how empires forget. Not all at once, like a collapse or a storm, but slowly in layers, like dust settling over a banquet no longer attended. The empire that once roared its triumph over Cleopatra did not vanish with violence or fire, but with paperwork, bureaucracy, and time. And through that long unraveling, something unexpected happened to Cleopatra. The woman they tried so hard to reduce into a myth remained standing in the echoes. Rome endured, yes, but only for a while. She, however, became permanent. When Octavian became Augustus, he set out to cleanse history of its ambiguities. He rewrote, resculpted, and reminted the narrative until there were no rivals left, only stepping stones beneath his sandals. Cleopatra was treated as the final stain, the final threat, a cautionary tale of foreignness, seduction, and feminine ambition. Rome had won. Egypt had fallen. Her body was gone. The coins were melted. Her statues softened into Roman beauty standards. her name dragged through Senate speeches and satire. But something in that very excess of rewriting betrayed the truth Cleopatra had scared them. A woman who could die on her own terms was dangerous. A queen who left no remains was unpredictable. A sovereign whose myth kept reshaping itself despite every effort to contain it was an empire's worst nightmare. And so, though Rome survived her in years, it did not survive her in memory, because memory does not operate by conquest. It operates by tension, by ache, by unfinished stories, and Cleopatra's was never finished. In the centuries that followed, Rome began to eat itself. Its leaders, once gods in marble, turned into footnotes of corruption. The republic it once claimed to preserve became a hollowed-out theater of ambition, then division, then collapse. Byzantium inherited its symbols, but not its certainty. The roads cracked, the aqueducts slowed, the language fractured. And all the while, Cleopatra remained not as a corpse in a tomb, but as a question in every century that came after. In medieval manuscripts, she appears as a figure of power and ruin. In Arabic texts, she is revered as a philosopher queen, a scientist, a sorceress. In Renaissance Europe, she becomes an obsession, not merely the last pharaoh, but the emblem of everything a woman could be and should not dare to become. Shakespeare made her immortal in iambic pentameter, and painters draped her in velvet and pearls she never wore. Each portrayal contradicts the last, yet none can quite let go of her. That, too, is power, the kind no empire can issue from a throne. What makes Cleopatra endure is not just her story, but the way it refuses to settle. She is forever poised at the edge of clarity, brilliant but misread, powerful but misunderstood, intimate yet unreachable. And this tension pulls at artists, historians, and rulers alike. She is seductive not because of beauty, but because of control. She is tragic not because she lost, but because she chose how to lose. Even in death, she upstaged them. Even in erasure, she refused to vanish. And the irony is cruel and perfect Rome, which once tried to immortalize itself in marble, left behind broken ruins and brittle texts. Cleopatra, with no tomb, no temple, no preserved portrait that is indisputably hers, remains more present in modern imagination than most emperors who wore laurels on their brows. She outlived them not by breathing, but by haunting, by refusing to be resolved, by living in the spaces between scholarship and longing. Walk through modern Alexandria, the city she once shaped, like a necklace of light across the Mediterranean, and you will find only hints of her. A harbor, a broken column, a whisper. But ask any guide, and they will speak of her as if she has just stepped out, as if her ship was seen yesterday, pale sails folding into sunset, as if her voice still curls through the salt air at dusk. It is not memory, it is presence. She is not remembered, she is sensed. And what does that mean, really, to outlive an empire? It means surviving their version of your story. It means becoming more real in imagination than you ever were in stone. It means being summoned again and again, not by decree, but by desire. And Cleopatra is summoned endlessly, by poets who do not believe in endings, by women who are tired of being reduced, by anyone who knows that power and softness can coexist in a single body. She is summoned not as proof of history, but as its refusal to conform. The great empire that crushed her is gone, its laws, its punishments, its buildings all faded or absorbed or irrelevant. But Cleopatra remains, not as a relic, but as a challenge. To see her clearly is to ask who tells history, and why do we still care what she felt in her final hour? Rome wanted her to be a mistake, a deviation, an indulgence. But history, real history, the kind that resists, turned her into a mirror. For every age that followed, she reflected something different: excess, wisdom, danger, grace, manipulation, vulnerability. and each generation saw in her not a lesson, but a lure. That is how you outlive an empire, not by surviving longer, but by mattering longer, by becoming impossible to delete, by existing wherever people begin to ask dangerous questions about who gets to be remembered and why. And so, in the deepest sense, Cleopatra did not vanish. She expanded. She became the unfinished sentence in Rome's final chapter, the quiet voice inside every throne room, whispering that what they feared most, a woman in command of her own story, had already happened, and could happen again. There are no statues that can hold her, no history books that contain her, no timeline in which she simply fades. She did what emperors never learned to do. She chose how she would be seen. She chose silence where others shouted, elegance where others marched, precision where others ruled with blunt force. And when it came time to leave, she did not ask to be honored. She asked only to be missed. And we still miss her. That, above all else, is what Rome could never erase. Cleopatra did not die in 30 BCE. She only stopped answering directly. She outlived the empire that conquered her not by surviving in flesh, but by becoming the one thing empires fear most, a story they cannot finish,